The intriguing and complex personal lives of white mistresses within the plantation context were truly unusual. These mistresses, second in importance only to the plantation owners themselves, assumed the role of overseeing the enslaved workforce. Their considerable authority was often wielded to exploit these individuals in various ways, leading to the inevitable exploitation of the slaves' most intimate aspects to fulfill the plantation owners' lustful desires. Female slaves would endure floggings for minor transgressions, while their mistresses callously subjected them to prolonged exposure under the scorching sun. The overall picture painted is one of abhorrent inhumanity, where slaves' lives were relegated to a subhuman state. This depiction finds resonance in the testimony of Harriet Jacobs, a former slave and the author of Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, which vividly portrays the environment of licentiousness and fear in which slave girls were raised. Dissatisfied with their constrained lives, these mistresses, albeit also in a form of servitude, were expected to exhibit obedience and cheerfulness. This expectation clashed with the reality of their husbands' numerous liaisons with black slaves, resulting in the birth of children who would eventually become mistresses themselves, a profoundly devastating circumstance that left them feeling repulsed. Their solitude during their husbands' absences prompted a search for fulfillment, leading to the exploitation of slaves to satisfy their own carnal desires. Married off at young ages, often around 15 or 16, these mistresses' lives grew progressively more desolate and melancholic. It became apparent that relationships between mistresses and slaves were far less frequent than those involving their husbands and female slaves. While there were indeed intimate connections between white mistresses and dark-skinned male slaves, these encounters were less acknowledged and understood. The intricate interplay of multiple forms of power and oppression is illustrated through an intersectional analysis. This framework allows us to comprehend how individuals occupying low status in one realm can simultaneously hold high status in another. Mistresses frequently coerced black slaves into sexual relationships, as confirmed by Captain Richard Hinton's accounts. Harriet Jacobs also provides insight into how mistresses exploited the intimacy of black slaves. These women recognized that female slaves were under their authority, much like their father's authority over them. This power dynamic enabled them to pursue relationships with the most vulnerable and brutalized slaves, exploiting their authority for personal gratification. Housewives, entrusted with upholding traditional Christian values and household harmony, held a revered status. Valued for their nurturing roles and virtuous character, they were expected to maintain the estate while embodying virtue. Yet, their own intimate lives adhered to societal norms and legal standards. Adultery, especially committed by women, faced harsh punishment, while white women were upheld as exemplars of morality and purity, despite the reality on plantations contrasting starkly. To understand the repugnance of slavery, one only needs to venture onto a southern plantation and assume the role of a black person. Only then will the veil be lifted, exposing the unimaginable horrors that challenge the very notion of souls with immortality. The prevalent narrative of the virtue of white women and their superiority over black women in matters of chastity was starkly contradicted by the brutal realities on plantations. White women from higher social strata justified their pursuit of intimate desires with black men due to perceived superiority and personal frustrations. These relationships often led to pregnancies that were concealed to avoid scandal. The biracial children born of these unions became a means for mistresses to assert power that eluded them in their relationships with their husbands, though society's condemnation and public humiliation loomed as constant threats. The stories of mixed-race children further underline the intricate web of power dynamics, exploitation, and deeply entrenched prejudices that defined the lives of white mistresses and their intimate involvement with black slaves in the fraught world of plantations. Planters' wives were supposed to be virtuous and honest girls and to direct all their love towards their husbands. They obviously took their frustrations out on the slaves because they were also a certain type of property of their husbands who were effectively their masters. Their husbands were allowed to exploit them in the same way as they did with their slaves, and then justifiable frustrations arose. Their freedom was significantly limited, and when they had to travel, they always did so with a male escort. Southern country slave codes, as low country slave codes demonstrate, female mastery was specifically inscribed into the colony's legislature from their earliest days. South Carolina law stated that slaves castrated for fleeing their master, mistress, or owner would be further mutilated for repeat escapes, while another from 1740 warned owners failing to provide slaves under his or her charge sufficient clothing, covering, or food, they would be held legally responsible. George's laws threatened to fine that master-mistress overseer of any slave who was hired without an approved ticket. Clauses detailing other civic responsibilities of slaveholders, including contributing the colony's militia and sending slaves to build public works, used similarly gender-neutral language, specifically taking into account female owners. Female slave ownership existed and was acknowledged. In fact, because so many male heads of households died prematurely amidst the instability of colonial life, some women gained unprecedented economic autonomy through it. These women independently managed large plantations and freely bought, sold, bequeathed, and hired slaves, which gave them the financial status to play important public roles within their communities. Well aware that the Southern patriarchy was generally hostile to female autonomy, such single slave-holding women protected their precarious privilege by replicating the same racist hierarchies that enabled Southern slavery. Slave mastery was not limited to the unmarried. Wealthy women entered marriage with slaves gifted to them by parents. And though legally wives, persons, and property enslaved or otherwise belonged to their husbands, the reality was more nuanced. Some mistresses distinguished between their own and husband's slaves. Former slave Silas Glenn remembered his mistress being good to the slaves that come into her from her daddy, but mean to those from her husband's side. Many firmly resisted their husband's attempts at managing, disciplining, or selling their enslaved property. White women who had grown up commanding slaves gained an internalized understanding of themselves as slaveholders with the associated rights and responsibilities and did not hesitate to assert this sense of independent ownership within their marriages. Some, such as Mrs. Annie Poor, who sold slaves for big prices after she'd trained them in specialized skills like cooking and carpentry, were acute businesswomen, true mistresses of the market. Such women studied slave prices, exploited market fluctuations, and, contrary to popular belief, personally attended auctions or hired male representatives to conduct such business on their behalf. In sum, both single and married slave-holding women gained economic power and personal agency within a repressive patriarchal system through the ownership and oppression of enslaved persons whom they considered first and foremost as their property. Brutal lives of female slaves. Secondly, while sources do not suggest that witnessing the sexual abuse of female slaves turned mistresses into sympathetic allies, it was actually quite the contrary. Powerless to stop men's transgressions and suffocated by the hypocritical ideals of female purity thrust upon them, most turned a complicit blind eye or further abused the victims, diarist and slave. Mistress Mary Boykin Chestnut, for instance, could call slavery a wrong and an inequity for the sexual disorder it produced, and characterized female slaves as prostitutes. In the same sentence, mistresses such as Boykin Chestnut self-pityingly casted themselves as the sole victims of white men's actions while extending little sympathy towards the enslaved victims. Instead, many reproduced racist stereotypes of black women as animalistic, hypersexual, and complicit in their own abuse. Boykin Chestnut felt faint sick witnessing a mulatto woman being sold for sexual purposes, but described the woman as lasciviously ogling the bitters with an expanded grin of excitement. Others, especially on smaller plantations where mistresses were constantly confronted with evidence of their husband's infidelity, took their anger out on victims. In his famed autobiographical narrative, Solomon Northup remembers witnessing an enslaved woman named Patsy being literally flayed due to her mistress' jealousy. The mistress often persuaded her husband or other slaves to whip Patsy out of spite and even attempted to bribe Northup to murder her. As Natalie Zachick notes, though some have framed such erratic, emotionally motivated violence as somehow less severe than the systematic abuse often associated with masters, its unpredictable nature likely terrorized and traumatized slaves. Thus, most mistresses' reactions to sexual abuse ultimately perpetuated the larger culture of racialized violence inherent to Southern slavery. Maternal slavery mistresses themselves exploited enslaved bodies in various ways. Emily West and Rosie J. Knight used the thriving market for enslaved wet nurses to highlight how mistresses manipulated and commodified enslaved women's mothering to serve their own needs. Mistresses' reasons for employing wet nurses ranged from illness to vanity, the fear that feeding would make their breast fall and become less aesthetically pleasing. Unlike slaves, mistresses had the privilege of choice in the matter, and their decisions determined the nature of enslaved women's. Mothering Harriet Jacobs, for example, remembers her mother being weaned at 3 months old so that the baby of the mistress might obtain sufficient food. Thus, mistresses placed their own desires and their children's nutritional needs above enslaved women's bodily autonomy, a uniquely gendered form of maternal violence. Moreover, while many fretted in personal writings about their own nursing-related worries, not one reflected on the physical or emotional toll of forcing an enslaved mother to set aside her child for theirs. Mistresses also continually interfered in enslaved women's parenting. Some supervised pregnancies, ministering home remedies, designating certain slaves to act as midwives, and occasionally deciding where births would occur. While this could be considered benevolent assistance, we cannot know how enslaved women felt about such intrusions into their bodies and intimate experiences. Neither was their interest in slaves' reproduction. Wholly altruistic, a healthy child was a valuable commodity who could later be separated from their family and sold for profit. In sum, as Jones Rogers argued, shared female experiences, like motherhood, did not cause mistresses to radically transcend societal norms. These instead became arenas where mistresses reconstructed racialized hierarchies to enforce their own privilege and power. White women on plantations. Some white women also participated in the sexual abuse of male slaves. In the intricate tapestry of history, an intriguing aspect emerges, revealing a lesser-known facet of the dynamics within the dark corridors of slavery. Thomas Balcerski's insights illuminate the complex web of relationships that interwove white mistresses and enslaved men, a story both shadowed and hinted at by contemporary observers. It is Harriet Jacobs, an observant chronicler of those times, who brings to light the peculiar dance of power and submission. She unveils a paradox. The very authority exerted over male slaves by their fathers also paved the way for some mistresses to exercise a similar dominion. Jacobs weaves a narrative of a mistress who strategically chose a deeply subjugated male slave as a partner, recognizing that in his vulnerability lay her advantage, an exertion of authority cunningly cloaked in a facade of choice. While such relationships stood as a minority, they lay bare the astute understanding white women had of the intricate threads of race, sex, and power that enveloped them. This strategic comprehension led them to recreate and manipulate the hierarchies that governed their world, a testament to the depth of agency they held within a society seemingly bent on denying it. It's a revelation that underscores the eerie intersection of sexuality and oppression. Even mundane interactions in the South held a hint of the perverse, an aura of sexuality born from the enforced scantiness of clothing worn by some enslaved individuals. The display of bare black male bodies in the presence of elite white women drew reactions ranging from curiosity to nonchalance, revealing a distorted norm of those times. Within this realm, violations of privacy manifested in unsettling ways. Mistresses mirrored masters in their treatment of unclothed slaves, subjecting them to beatings, or even demanding intimate massages and services. A sinister power play unfolded as some white women resorted to threats, silencing potential revelations by accusing enslaved men of rape if they dared to expose the truth. Just as the male counterparts manipulated societal stereotypes, the mistresses too harnessed the charged associations between blackness and sexual aggression. The mosaic of these instances reveals how white women, often perceived as marginalized within a male-dominated world, seized upon the vulnerability of enslaved bodies to carve out a realm of transgressive influence. Denied conventional agency, they found an unsettling empowerment through domination and violation. In this journey through history's enigmatic corridors, we peel back layers of complexity, encountering a narrative that defies conventional understanding. Balcerski's revelations beckon us to question and explore, to engage with a past both chilling and intriguing. As the light shines on these forgotten corners, we find ourselves invited to a deeper understanding of the complex forces that shaped human interactions during those turbulent times. If this exploration has ignited your curiosity, don't hesitate to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. The pages of history hold countless stories waiting to be unraveled, stories that illuminate the shadows and shed light on the overlooked narratives of our past.